You're live?
Okay, great. Hello, everyone. Sorry about the slight delay, but we are ready to start. Welcome to this webinar on... Okay, great. Hello, everyone. Sorry about the slight delay, but we are ready to start. Welcome to the... Okay, I'm sorry. I'm going to start again. Hi, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to this webinar on World War Against Fascism, remembering China's role in the victory. It's organized by the Friends of Socialist China and the International Manifesto Group. I'm Radhika Desai. I'm convener of the International Manifesto Group, and I will be moderating this event. On the 3rd of September this year, Beijing put on the most impossibly perfect military parade seen in recent history, or perhaps even in history, as the government of the People's Republic of China celebrated 80 years since Chinese, Korean, Mongolian, and largely communist-led resistance forces scored their heroic victory against Japan in the World War against fascism. In the Western press, one could detect three main strands of commentary. The Western neoliberal establishment, which is in power in nearly all Western countries except the United States, could only protest impotently as the Eurocentric narratives about the Second World War having been won by European and US forces were displaced. They could only scoff unconvincingly as the People's Republic of China made its rightful claim to be considered the leading force behind victory in the Pacific theater of the greatest war humankind had suffered. Russia, the successor state to the Soviet Union, had also made its own equally rightful claim regarding the European theater just months earlier, an event which we also commemorated here on the International Manifesto Group. The Western neoliberal establishment had to endure these forces, having the temerity to insist on the fundamental historical point that it needed communist forces to win the war caused by capitalism and its imperialism, and that without these communist forces, the homelands of capitalism would have succumbed to fascism. Worse, the US-led West had to look on aghast as China's military hardware, in many cases surpassing US weaponry technologically, paraded down Chang'an Avenue and across Tiananmen Square. And to top it all, they had nightmares about a new, fearsome international alliance being formed. Whereas the heads of state of all socialist countries were gathered there for the first time, the West could only fix its fearful gaze on Presidents Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un, flanking President Xi as his guests of honor, and President Pezeshkian standing not far behind. In the throes of their tortuous nightmare, the Western press let fly a barrage of new epithets. These people constituted the axis of upheaval, the axis of aristocracies, a quartet of chaos, and even a deadly quartet. They venomously coined a new acronym, CRINK, referring to China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Needless to say, to most around the world, it was clear that Western democracy had been hollowed out for decades, that the US-led West was the fomenter-in-chief of chaos, that the Chinese government and the governments of most of those on the podium on the 3rd of September enjoyed a deeper and broader legitimacy than any government in the West, and that these countries were increasingly forming the Pacific core in a world buffeted by storms originating in the West. The second strand of commentary was, of course, President Trump himself. He is himself a symptom of the crisis of the US-led Western neoliberal establishment. He issued one of his characteristically snide messages. He said on Truth Social, "May President Xi and the wonderful people of China have a great and lasting day," whatever that is, of celebration. Please give my warmest regards to Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un as you conspire against the United States of America. End of quote. Whether the occupant of the White House had anything serious to convey or was simply flying off the handle in his confusion is anybody's guess. What we do know is that he is caught between his desperation for a trade deal with China, the deal that alone stands in the way of the US's and the US's economic and the Republicans' electoral disasters, and his desire to appear to be the one thing he is not, namely in control. Finally, an academic undercurrent sought to downplay the Chinese communist role in the war. Even Harvard's Rana Mitter, who has done so much to contest Eurocentrism and bring the forgotten war in the Pacific to world attention, opposed communist Chinese claims. Historians would say that overall, he declaimed, the majority of the wartime effort, including the set battles, were actually fought by China's nationalists. He relied on little more than stereotypes about communism to dismiss the People's Republic's claims as mere self-aggrandizing propaganda. In this webinar, we need to uncover the realities of the communist role in defeating fascism, because these realities are, well, realities. And because in a world where fascist forces are returning, recalling this has become more urgent than ever before. Just as in the interwar years, fascism today is simply the foaming crest of a wave of right-wing forces that has been rising throughout the neoliberal decades. In the homelands of capitalism and beyond, they are forming movements and parties and taking office municipally, provincially, and sometimes even nationally. Their growing strength was only underlined last weekend by the frightening gathering of 150,000 people in a Unite the Kingdom demonstration organized by fascist forces in the heart of London. These fascists or proto-fascists, you can take your nomenclatural pick, these forces are locked in a macabre tango with the neoliberal establishment of most Western countries. Both forces are committed to the preservation of today's senile, productively debilitated, financialized, predatory and speculative capitalism, which is fast losing legitimacy. Both combine force and fraud, though in differing emphases. While fascist forces incline to force, the neoliberal establishments incline to fraud. While against the fraudulent neoliberals, the fascists can appear more honest, though they are not. Against the threatening fascists, the neoliberals can appear kinder, though they are also not. Both involve inflicting the same intolerable economic system and political repression on the people at home. Meanwhile, abroad, a combination of war, sanctions, color revolutions, and the use of fascist proxies, as in Ukraine and Israel, seek to compel compliance with imperialism and form a world, imperialism from a world increasingly capable of refusing such compliance. Only well-organized and consolidated left forces can rise to the major economic, political, and cultural challenges of our time. How difficult that emergence still is today was demonstrated just recently by the disastrous split in Britain's nascent left-wing party, your party. Be that as it may, the construction of a viable and effective anti-imperialist left is the only way today, and setting the historical record straight is the first step towards it. We have today with us an absolutely wonderful array of authoritative speakers who are going to help us to do exactly that. So with that, let me go to our speakers. I will introduce them as they come up, and then after they finish speaking, they will each speak for about 10 minutes each. And after they finish speaking, we will have some questions and answers. So please make a note of the questions you want to ask. So our first speaker will be Chen Weihua, who was former EU Bureau Chief of China Daily, the English language newspaper from China. So Chen, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you see me here? I cannot see my own image. Okay, that's great.
Let me just check. No, actually, Paul, can you see Chen?
No, I can't.
Yeah, because because the video is on, and so I don't see my image.
One second. Just let me just find you, Chen.
So the problem will be at Weihua's end. Weihua, if you're able to
if there's a video button with a
Yeah.
little arrow next to it, if you click on the arrow, you might be able to select a different camera.
Okay. Auto frame. Hold on. I don't know. Adjust. Okay. No. Video setting. Camera.
Yeah, from our end, you are allowed to use your camera, so there is no prohibition on that.
He just turned off his mic.
Oh, I've asked him to unmute. Chen, can you hear us? You should unmute yourself because we can't hear you now.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Now we can hear you.
But you cannot see me, right?
No, unfortunately. I don't know. We were seeing you earlier. I don't know what happened.
You were
Oh,
seeing
I
me.
know what it is. I know what it is. I think your camera needs to be switched on. You know, like at the top of your computer, there's a little switch and you have to turn it. I think it's suggesting to me that that switch is off.
Okay, yeah, that could be. How do I do that?
It's on my computer. It's right at the top of my camera.
Yeah.
Top of my screen, rather, I should say, where the camera is. There will be a little
okay
physical
now?
switch, a physical switch that you can just turn it in the other direction.
Yeah, I think I did. Let me see. I think. Oh, is it okay now?
Sorry,
No?
and what has happened to our participants? Oh, sorry, I see. Okay.
Should I just use my maybe the
Phone, maybe just use your
cell
phone.
phone?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's I'm sorry for that. Oh, because it's now it's getting weird because the phone, the phone is working earlier. It's not responding to me.
Should we take the next speaker first? And
Yes,
then...
I think we should go to the
maybe.
next speaker, and maybe Carlos, if you can help Chen sort it out, that would be very good. So Jodie, you are next. So maybe you should now speak. So let me just introduce Jodie. So we will go to our next speaker. The next speaker is Jodie Evans, who is co-founder of the very important activist organization in the United States called Pink. So Jodie, please go ahead. And I'm going to have to find your slides. So let me just do that. I will show them as you have requested.
Okay, in the order. Thank you.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to share today with my beautiful comrades. I'm shocked by how many people ask me, how did we get here to this frightening moment we are currently living in? The answer, imperialism and capitalism, which I call the war economy, that exists on a bed of lies, myths, and propaganda. The same imperialism and capitalism is set on a war to destroy China that has emerged from these 80 years as vibrant, growing, serving their people, and peace on the planet, the peace that the people across the world long for. So I think it's incumbent on us to expose the truths about how we got here, the dark underbelly of imperialism that is purposely hidden. Today, I want to share 3 graphs that I found most shocking in this enlightening piece that is soon to be published in the Tricontinental on the 80th anniversary of the global war to end fascism. 3 graphs that destroy imperial mythology. So, any luck?
Share them now. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
So the first one is
figure 3. So this is, figure 3 is called the Western Calculations on the Relative Value of Life. This chart exposes the racial calculus of American aid during humanity's supposed good war against evil. Look at the numbers. The United States distributed $50.1 billion in land lease aid. Of the 31.4 billion allocated to the British Empire, 85% went to 58.3 million whites, while 443 million colonial subjects received scraps. The mathematics of racism. Whites comprised 11% of the British Empire's population, but received 85% of the aid. The per capita calculation destroys any pretense of fighting for freedom. Each white person in Britain, Australia, and New Zealand received $442. Each person in China, British India, and Ceylon received 4.40 cents. That's a 101-to-1 ratio. The US valued white lives at 100 times the value of Asian lives, not as rhetoric, but as budget line items, signed by Roosevelt, approved by Congress, documented in ledgers. But the death valuation reveals even deeper atrocity. Take total aid and divide by deaths. Each white death was valued at $52,900 in American aid. Each Chinese or Indian death, $161. That is a 329-to-1 ratio. Washington calculated that 329 Chinese lives equaled 1 British life. China fought Japan alone from 1931 to 1941, 10 years, while America sold Japan their oil and steel. And I mean almost all their oil and steel. When the US finally entered, China received $1.6 billion total. After defeating Japan, the US gave Chiang Kai-shek $3 billion to fight communists, double what China received to fight fascism. The formula was mathematical: minimal help against Japan, maximum support against communism. That wasn't oversight, that was policy. The same Roosevelt who proclaimed the 4 freedoms calculated freedom's value by race. The same America that called itself democracy's arsenal armed whites and abandoned Asians. Every dollar documented the strategy: preserve white strength, let Asians bleed, then claim victory. These aren't interpretations. These are Treasury Department numbers, congressional appropriations, the hierarchy of American liberation documented in its own accounting. Could we turn to the next slide, 5? So figure 5 is who paid the price, the death distribution. This single chart destroys 70 years of Western propaganda against who won the war. The global distribution of deaths, Soviet Union and China, 61.9% of all deaths. The colonial world, 11%. The US and Britain combined, 1.5%. Let those percentages burn into your memory. For every American or British death, 41 Soviets and Chinese died. For every Western casualty, 7 colonial subjects perished. The deployment pattern tells the story. By June 1941, Germany had committed 151 divisions, 73% of total Weimar Strait, to invading Soviet Union. The Red Army faced and destroyed this unprecedented force. At Stalingrad alone, the Soviets eliminated an entire German army group. At Kirks, they broke the Weimar offensive capacity forever. By the time D-Day arrived, 730 days after the promised date, the Red Army had already destroyed 607 German divisions, while the Western Allies faced only 176. In Asia, China tied down 60% of Japanese land forces and 95% of puppet troops through 14 years of resistance. Every Chinese soldier holding a position with obsolete weapons prevented a Japanese soldier from attacking elsewhere. The Chinese communist base areas alone engaged more Chinese forces than the entire US Pacific campaign. The wounded vanish from Western history entirely. 13 to 18 million Soviets wounded, ignored. 11 to 26 million Chinese wounded, erased. When a Western soldier is wounded, it is a casualty worthy of remembrance. When tens of million Asians are maimed, they disappear from history like they never existed. But here's what the percentages means. Socialist forces with less than 8% of world GDP destroyed 80% of fascist military power. The capitalist powers with 30% of world GDP preserved their strength while they let others bleed. This wasn't unfortunate timing. This was the strategy. Let fascism and communism destroy each other, then claim victory from the corpses. 27 million Soviets dead, 14% of their population, 24 million Chinese dead, 415,000 Americans, 0.3% of the population. The arithmetic convicts: maximum sacrifice by those with least, maximum preservation by those with most. So if I could have the next slide, figure 9, please. And these will be coming out in Tricontinental. I know there's a lot to study here, but I think these speak to this moment. So figure 9 is the arithmetic of erasure, Korea. And this whole article started with me returning from North Korea with numbers that I'd never heard before. So, which is where China had to go fight. This table, and also Mao lose his son, just to say. This table documents how the anti-fascist war seamlessly became anti-communist genocide. 5 years, that's all. From defeating fascism in 1945 to incinerating Korea in 1950. The same B-29s that firebombed Tokyo were dropping napalm on Korean villages. The same generals who liberated Asia were now destroying it. Look at the scale. Between 1.5 and 3 million North Koreans dead, 15 to 31% of pre-war population. General Curtis LeMay's exact words: "We burned down every town in North Korea." Killed off what, 20% of the population, he said? He said 20%. Korean sources document 30%. When you kill a third of a nation, we have a word for that. It's genocide. The US dropped 635 tons of bombs and 32,000 tons of napalm on a country the size of Pennsylvania. More explosive power than the entire Pacific theater of World War II. Against a nation that never attacked America, against a people whose crime was choosing socialist reunification over capitalist partition. MacArthur himself vomited when surveying the destruction. His words: "I have never seen such devastation. Those thousands of women and children, it curdled my stomach." The architect of slaughter, sickened by his own work, it continued. 18 of 22 major North Korean cities obliterated, destruction ranging from 65% to 100%. With napalm, there's no wounded. Flesh melts, lungs sear, everyone dies. The conventional bombing created countless more casualties, crushed under rubble, orphaned, starving. Where are we seeing that right now? Where are we seeing this played out right now? Yet, no nation in modern history has suffered such concentrated destruction and 30% of the population. The comparison reveals the pattern. World War II, 3% of humanity dead. Korea, up to 31% of North Korea dead. Vietnam, 3.1 million dead. 58,000 Americans, a 53-to-1% ratio. The formula never changes. Japan surrendered in 1945. By 1950, the US was committing genocide in Korea. No pause, no peace dividend. The killing never stopped. It just changed targets, from fascists to communists, from Germans and Japanese to Koreans and Chinese. The same weapons, the same generals, the same lies about liberation. This is what these numbers document. The world anti-fascist war never ended. It morphed seamlessly into a permanent war against any nation choosing socialist development. The real enemy was never fascism. Fascism was capitalism's emergency response to a socialist threat. The real enemy was always socialism itself. China is not our enemy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jodie. What a brilliant and I should say chilling and relevant set of messages. I so completely agree with you that we are actually undergoing the same war still. It's interesting to look at it as a continuous war to subordinate the rest of the world, in which the emergence of fascism is really a result, actually, not only capitalism's emergency response, but a result of the fact that capitalism contained within so many contradictions that it led to the First World War, then the denial of colonies to Germany, etc. And so out of inter-capitalist contradictions. But anyway, what a powerful way to start. We will now have another start, which is the original start. I think Chen Weihua is able to join us. So Chen Weihua, you please also give us your presentation. And just to remind everybody, Chen Weihua is the former EU Bureau Chief of China Daily. So please go ahead, Chen Weihua.
Yeah, thank you very much, Radhika. And yeah, thank you very much, Judy, for the wonderful speech. And thank you for the organizer, for this very timely, I would say, necessary event, and it gave me the opportunity. I think it's very timely and necessary and important on multiple fronts, especially when the world is facing grave challenges of war and peace, and some Western politicians obviously trying to distort and rewrite history. First, just 3 days ago, September 18th marked the 94th anniversary of this September 18th incident known in China, also known as the Mongolian incident, when the Imperial Japanese Guangdong Army launched a full-scale invasion of Northeast China and later established a puppet government there. So it was also the beginning of China's 14 years against the Japanese aggression, which of course ended in 1945 with the surrender of Imperial Japan. And second, this year marked the 80th anniversary of the end of the World War II, or the World Anti-Fascist War. And the Chinese people's resistance against the Japanese aggression has a great significance, not only for China and for Asia, but for the world. In the ultimate defeat of fascists in Japan, in Germany, and in Italy. And the Chinese were a major resistance force fighting Japanese aggressors in the East battlefields. Just in 1945, some 1.28 million Japanese soldiers surrendered in China at the end of the war. At the same time, more than 35 million Chinese people lost their lives under the brutal Japanese aggression and occupation in China in that 14 years. Imagine if there was no Chinese people's resistance against the Japanese fascists. The Imperial Japanese Army would probably have more soldiers sent to put pressure on the then Soviet Union, the Red Army, and making situation much more worse in Europe by aligning more strongly with Nazi Germany. And the atrocity committed by the Japanese Imperial Army against the Chinese people were appalling. I'm now actually in Wuxi. It's halfway from between my home city Shanghai and Nanjing, and so obviously everyone here heard of this Nanjing massacre. About 300,000 Chinese people were slaughtered by the Japanese Imperial Army in the matter of just a few weeks. And the fourth, we need to, and we should remember and talk about the history today. Why? Because more than 80 years later, many politicians in Japan still refuse to acknowledge that atrocity in Nanjing happened, or in that magnitude. And Japanese school textbooks greatly played down and whitewashed that part of history. So not many people know the exact, what happened then. So this is, we also have Japanese politicians paying tribute often to this Yasukuni Shrine, which honors the World War II Class A war criminals. So it's really, for Chinese, it's really putting salt on the wound of the Chinese people. It's like what would happen when Germans pay homage to Adolf Hitler today. It would be outrage in Europe and in the Western world. But you don't hear that outrage expressed by Western politicians much when Japanese politicians go to Yasukuni Shrine. Of course, I would say Germany has done a much better job than Japan in facing its and confessing its World War II atrocities. Unlike some Japanese politicians, even when they apologize, it's always half-hearted. They never have a sincerely apologize for the war crimes during the Second World War. And in Europe, we have the top EU diplomat. I just left Europe last month. We have the EU top diplomat, Kaja Kallas, questioning any role played by China and the Soviet Union during the Second World War. It is a great insult to the sacrifice made by the Chinese people in the 14 years of resistance against the Japanese aggression, and it's an insult to the Soviet Red Army, which liberated much of Europe from Nazi Germany. I still remember, when they commemorate sort of the liberation of Auschwitz concentration camp in Poland. They didn't invite Russia. They don't want to mention the Soviet Red Army, as if someone else liberated those Jews from the concentration camp. So this should not be tolerated. It's a distortion of history. And, the fact that there has been no outrage about Kaja Kallas' ignorance or deliberate distortion of World War II history, whether from the European Commission or from European Parliament or major EU member state leaders, is itself shocking and outrageous to me. This is deeply worrying sign, I think we should remember history because we don't want to repeat that kind of history, and we don't want to repeat that horrible wars. But we have seen the NATO expansion posing threat to others. NATO even wants to expand to Asia, talking about coming to East Asia. Describing China's threat. It's a total lie. We have hundreds of 100, 200 U.S. military bases encircling China. I mean, you already mentioned some of it in the speech. And we have just heard the outrageous comments by U.S. President to take back the Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan because he claimed it was built by the U.S. and it is only 1 hour from China's nuclear weapon facilities. I think there's such provocation and warmongering rhetoric, should alarm the whole world. And not to mention, his rhetoric on Venezuela, on Panama Canal, on many of the issues. Like many of you in the anti-war movement, I consider myself a pacifist, but I have increasingly been supportive of the Chinese government modernization of its defense. China has no interest in invading other nations. If China invaded Europe tomorrow, I will be the first one to come out to oppose it. It's good. China's good track record in the past 45 years is a proof. China has not been involved in any wars, has never dropped a bomb or fired a shot on foreign soil. No major country in the world can claim that same kind of good record. A China with a strong defense capability will not only prevent itself from being bullied again by those warmongering powers, like in our century of humiliation, when the Western power imposed many unequal treaties on China. And the days they could bully China, push China around, force China into unequal treaty, such as UK forcing open trade on China, forcing China to cede Hong Kong, or Japan forcing China to cede Taiwan, are long gone. A China with strong defense capability will be vital for world peace and for a multipolar world. And a just and multipolar world is one where developing countries from Asia to Africa to Latin America will no longer be bullied by Western powers. It's very important. I know a lot of Western politicians and media have tried very hard to portray China as a global threat, but it is only a reflection of their lack of knowledge of history or their deliberate distortion of history, just like Kaya Kallas. I would also add, lastly, the significance of today's meeting, because it came at a time of the United Nations General Assembly, is a meeting in New York City. China has always been a supporter of the international system with UN as the center. It's a sharp contrast to the views by the US, NATO, European Union, or G7, which regard themselves as representing the international community, where, other countries in the developing world, in the global south, don't really count. I'll stop here. I will be happy to join the discussion later. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chen Weihua. I think that was really fantastic. And I think your experience, of course, your long experience in Europe has made you so wonderfully sensitive to exactly the ways in which the dominant discourse in Europe is, in fact, hell-bent on distorting the history around the Second World War, around fascism, around the role played by the Soviets, and then, of course, also the Chinese in defeating it. So again, the comparison was really instructive. So thank you very much. We will now go to our third speaker, but before we do that, may I please request that nobody should try to interfere with the ongoing proceedings. Please do not share your screen. Please keep yourself muted. We will have plenty of time for questions and answers later. And you'll have plenty of time to bring in the points you consider to be relevant. Okay, so our next speaker will be Professor Ken Hammond. Professor Ken Hammond is a historian in the University of New Mexico and one of the foremost critical scholars of China in the United States. So Ken, it's great to have you, and please go ahead.
Thank you, Radhika. It's wonderful to be here. I appreciate the Friends of Socialist China and the International Manifesto Group for putting this together and including me in the process. So it's very good to see so many people here, and I'm learning a lot already from the presentations that have preceded mine. I want to, we put this together. This got put together, in honor, of course, of the 80th anniversary of the end of the War of Resistance against Japanese aggression in China. And of course, Chen Weihua pointed out that it's also the 14th, the 94th anniversary of the 1931 invasion that began really the long period of resistance in China. But when we think about, the sort of theme of our gathering today, China's role in the defeat of fascism, the victory over fascism. I want to sort of complicate that just a little bit by recognizing that fascism, of course, as we understand in World War II, was not simply a matter of Germany and Japan. Italy, of course, was under Mussolini. Spain, although they remained neutral in the war, had a fascist dictatorship under Franco. So fascism was a wider problem. And of course, as Jodie talked about and Chen Weihua referred to as well, fascism remains with us today and is something against which most of us, I think, are involved in struggling now. But when I think about China's role in defeating fascism back in the 1930s and 40s, it's not really so much a matter of China defeating, China as a political organization defeating this. It's the Chinese people, the people of China who fought to resist against the Japanese invading their country. And those people were also, of course, involved in struggle on multiple fronts and being led by the Communist Party. And of course, with the Red Army, Chinese Red Army as the leading fighting force, they faced a challenge that encompassed, of course, the immediate and most pressing task of resistance against the Japanese invaders, but also that took place in the context of a conflict within China, which had been going on since the 1920s between the Communist Party and the fascist nationalists. We should remember always that at the same time that the Red Army and the CPC was fighting to maintain itself, fighting to survive, the nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek was receiving military aid, training, and weapons and machinery from Nazi Germany. So the fact that eventually the Axis, the fascist Axis, comes to settle on Japan and Germany and Italy. Certainly Chiang Kai-shek flirted, more than flirted, with fascism, with fascist links to Germany in the mid 1930s, and so the CPC and the Red Army find themselves waging a conflict, waging a struggle against Japan, but also in the context of an ongoing struggle with the nationalists. And that was something which, again, as was mentioned, the nationalists. I don't want to suggest that the nationalists did nothing in resisting the Japanese. Certainly, there were many patriotic fighters in the nationalist forces, and even among some of the officer corps and all. But at the top of that government was a regime that was not interested in prioritizing the war with Japan. They did what they had to protect themselves and survive, but they didn't really play the main leading role in trying to defeat the Japanese, trying to stop the Japanese, get rid of the Japanese, and end Japanese imperialism overall. That was the Red Army, that was the Communist Party, and that was the people of China. The party, of course, leading that struggle, trying to organize and guide that struggle, and the Red Army being the primary fighting forces, but guerrilla forces, local groups around North China that came out of the villages, they took part in this fighting as well, and it was that mass movement quality or the resistance against Japan that really drove it and made it as effective as it was. And of course, when as Jodie mentioned, and I think Chen Weihua as well, tying down well over 1 million Japanese troops in China during the war, that had a crippling effect on Japan's overall military capabilities. In tandem, or perhaps in triplicate, with all of those, with those two, was the deeper struggle, the real profound struggle, the class struggle that the Communist Party was leading. This was the struggle to overthrow the old system, the system of landlord capitalism, industrial capitalism in the cities, and that they experimented even while fighting against the invaders and resisting the efforts of the nationalists to destroy them. They were able to experiment with land reform, with transforming the old remnants of ancient family systems and things like that. So these struggles, they really fought on three fronts: against the Japanese, against the nationalists, and against the old ruling class, the old ruling classes. So I think we really want to recognize that struggle and the ability of the communist leadership to pursue that was quite remarkable, quite remarkable. And that victory, those successive victories, the defeat of Japan, the defeat of the nationalists, and the victory of the revolution and the empowerment of the people, the working people of China, that takes place eventually based on their devotion and their commitment to leadership. So mobilizing the people, working with the people, serving the people, this was the guiding principle. And of course, the contrast with the anti-fascist struggles which took place in Western Europe, the United States, Britain, the French government in exile, certainly they were opposed to fascism because, as was pointed out, fascism was also opposed to the predominance of the capitalist ruling classes. In fascism, the state tries to direct the economy rather than the state serving as an instrument of the capitalist elites. And so, those elites, they wanted to get rid of fascism so that they could reassert their power and reclaim their privileges over the people in Europe as well. And the same was true, of course, in China, that Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists resist the Japanese, not in order to create a more just and equitable China, but in order to regain their capacity to exploit the Chinese people more effectively themselves. So this struggle on three fronts goes on, comes to culmination over Japan in 1945, the defeat of the nationalists by 1949, and the ongoing victory over, capitalism and the old landlord capitalist system to see China build its socialist future, to see China embark upon this long and continuing prolonged struggle to create that society of socialism, justice, equity that the people fought for and continue to work for and labor for today. So I think this is a moment when hats off, to the Chinese people, hats off to anti-fascist fighters everywhere during those critical years in the middle of the 20th century. And today, wherever we see the threat of fascism reviving, denying the history that if we forget it, we're going to repeat it. We need to be alert to these dangers, and we need to dedicate ourselves, just as the CPC and the Red Army and the Chinese people did, to this struggle, however long it takes, however many years it takes, because this is the only way that we're going to be able to create the future that we all dream of. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ken. That was, again, also so enlightening, particularly your reflections on how the international alignments took place to align Japan with Germany and Italy on the one hand, and also, of course, very importantly, the very distinctive political characters of the nationalist and communist forces in China. So that was really enlightening. Thank you so much. We have now another very interesting and amazing speaker, Jenny Clegg. Jenny Clegg is a China scholar, author of China in a Multipolar World, and an activist. So Jenny, please go ahead.
Thanks very much, Radhika. I hope you can hear me okay.
Yes.
Well, I was fortunate enough to see the military parade in Tiananmen Square on September the 3rd. I was one of the specially invited international friends with family connections to China's resistance. My father was national organizer for the China Campaign Committee in London, which mobilized in solidarity with the Chinese people's resistance from 1937. What I'd like to talk about is first, just briefly, some of the overall context of World War II, then the impact on China, why China's contribution to the defeat of fascism has been erased from history in the West, and why we should remember. So, first of all, taking the date back to 1931, Japan's invasion of Manchuria, gives us a longer time frame to take in the international context. First, that the world was in a state of flux. Britain, still the lead imperialist power, had been catastrophically hit by the 1929 Wall Street crash, leaving a power vacuum. And Japan stepped in, turbocharged by its rapid militarization, and its aggression really shattered the fragile efforts of the League of Nations to build some structure of peace. Beyond words of condemnation, the world's major powers really failed to act, and this emboldened Japan and the forces of fascism worldwide. So we had the Nazi election in 1932, Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia, Franco's coup in Spain. Then in 1936, Japan signed the Anti-Comintern Pact with Nazi Germany, and this made its subsequent further invasion into China in 1937 as an act of world war. In Manchuria, local resistance was brutally suppressed, but Chiang Kai-shek continued to concentrate his forces against the communist bases until 1937, when he finally agreed to join the CPC-initiated United Front. So up to 1941, the Chinese people stood virtually alone. Britain leaned towards appeasement, even closing China's supply route, the Burma Road, in 1940. And US loans came too little too late. The Soviet Union did supply military and financial aid under a secret agreement with the Kuomintang from 1937 to 1940. And anti-fascist and anti-imperialist groups in the West also rallied, inspired by Edgar Snow's Red Star over China, published in 1937. And the China Campaign Committee, which I mentioned before in Britain, for example, embraced China's cause as Britain's cause in the fight against global fascism. Within China, the crisis awakened a national collective consciousness. In the last months of 1937, as the big coastal cities of Shanghai and so on fell, millions of traumatized refugees fled inland with no clear destination and few belongings. Inland cities and Red Army bases were overwhelmed. Now, China, of course, was one of the poorest countries in the world. There was hardly any medical care. There were no refugee camps. There were no international relief agencies. Reports from the battlefields were absolutely horrific, with bodies lying all over the place, dead and wounded, without any medical assistance. So the Chinese people had to rely on themselves. The entire population rallied in the war effort to provide health and social welfare, care for war orphans, and groups of refugees organized into cooperatives to produce blankets, uniforms, all sorts of goods. That was the famous Indusco movement, or Gung He, worked together, initiated by Rui Ali and Helen and Edgar Snow. The country was the most transformed by war, socially, culturally, politically. Class and gender barriers were shattered as westernized city elites began to rebuild their lives in the semi-feudal hinterland, the urban and the rural mixing together. Both nationalists and communists sought to raise consciousness through mass rallies, the nationalists in the early part of the war, that is, and mass campaigns popularizing Chinese culture using folklore forms to create a modern culture of resistance. So that was important. Between 1937 and 1945, the CPC areas expanded from a population of 1 million with an army of 30,000 to a population of 100 million and an army of 900,000. In these areas, war was a crucible for the development of Marxism-Leninism, with Mao's theories of new democracy, the relationship between theory and practice, and the systematizing of contradictions of imperialism, feudalism, and capitalism, so as to coordinate the nationalist movement and the peasant and the working class movements in a long-term strategy advancing resistance into revolution. So in 1941, Japan's expansion into the Pacific forced Churchill and Roosevelt to recognize China as an ally and an equal, and the UK abrogated the unequal treaties, except for Hong Kong, in 1943. And as an allied power, China's United Front became a founding member of the United Nations in 1945. So we can say Japan's defeat was brought about by China, the US, and the UK together, with the Soviet Union turning east in August 1945. But then, with Japan's surrender, US and UK priorities changed. From inter-imperialist rivalries, the aim was now to, and I quote, maintain Anglo-Saxon superiority over post-war Asia. In reality, though, the war in Asia was a war of liberation, as the defeat of worldwide fascism gave way to surging movements for national liberation. The end of World War then did not end war in Asia, as the European colonial powers set out to regain their hold. As far as China was concerned, the people had not fought so hard for so long against Japanese imperialism merely to become hostage to the US. And as we know, after 4 years of civil war, the CPC, still leading a democratic front, defeated the Kuomintang despite its US backing. As Mao saw it when interviewed by Edgar Snow in 1936, China's revolution was a key factor in world revolution. And so we saw continuing revolutions in the East, with the defeat of the Dutch in Indonesia in 1949, also after 4 years of conflict, the Vietnamese defeating the French in 1945, and that was just after the Koreans had fought the US-led UN forces to a standstill, and whilst in Malaya, communist-led guerrilla struggle continued to oppose British colonial rule up to 1960. So this myth about the US World War II victory was to play a critical role in the restructuring of imperialism from direct colonial rule into a US hegemonic neo-colonialism, simultaneously isolating China's collectivist resistance and sidelining the UN. I think that there are three lessons that I would like to draw from this: about the dangers of the world situation today, about China's intentions, and about how we stop things spiraling out of control. Just as in the 1930s build-up to World War, we now see the international order in a state of flux, with the US in relative decline, unilateral military actions proliferating, the US bombing of Iran, Israel and Qatar, all alongside the ongoing war in Ukraine and the Gaza genocide. And again, all this carries on with no restraint. In the 1930s, even though the fascist elements were not coordinating until later, there was not just a series of disconnected events between 31 and 37. Japan's invasion of Manchuria emboldened others, so we had a snowballing effect into the World War. So this, it seems to me, is the history that China is calling on the world to reflect on. But as China itself also steps into the vacuum, we are told in the West that it wants to dominate the world, to displace the US as world leader. And so things are turned on their head. China, our ally, is our enemy, and the former Axis powers, Germany and Japan, are our allies and must be rearmed. In fact, China's real intentions remain obscured by the failure to acknowledge its role in World War II, that China made great sacrifices in the past in order to become part of a new peaceful world order, and that has been its enduring goal. So this is my first takeaway from September the 3rd, China's resilience in the pursuit of peace and UN values. You know, the worst of the situation today, in my opinion, is how the UN has been rendered irrelevant when we need it most. Apparently, Western powers will not accept an organization with China as an equal. They continue to deny the real victory of World War II, which was the fact that fascism was defeated through international solidarity of people across the world. And that's my second takeaway, the need to rebuild international solidarity. We have to think about our shared future, the Chinese are saying, because of what history tells us about our shared past. I think that that is the deeper meaning of the VJ Day commemoration. Thank you.
That was absolutely brilliant, Jenny. What a wonderful historical outline. I should have known, but didn't, that you would have been there at the military parade. And it's really fantastic to have you. And I think you gave and obviously being there also concentrated your mind, and you gave a brilliant, I think, outline, bringing up also to its relevance today. And you are one of the two people we are honored to have here who attended the military parade, as we'll see. But next, we will have, next speaker is KJ Noh. KJ Noh is an independent and very prolific journalist, educator, and writer. So KJ, please go ahead. I know you have some slides to share. Hope you'll be able to do that successfully.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm very honored to be with everybody today. So I'm just want to check that my slides are visible.
Yes, they are.
Okay. So I think that one of the things that we have to remember in China's victory over fascism 80 years ago is, of course, that World War II started in 1931 for China in the invasion of Shenyang in Liaoning province. And the human costs, as others have already said, were incredible. 35 million killed, 10 million enslaved. I'll get to that later. 400,000, of which 400,000 were comfort women. We know about the Nanjing massacre, and we also know about Unit 731. One of the things that I want to highlight is China fought the Japanese fascists, and it defeated them at great cost. But I would argue that this war is not over, and in fact, it has continued to the current moment. Many of you saw the celebration parade. The Western media highlighted the advanced weaponry, but none of them highlighted the fact that 80,000 doves were released at the end of the parade, signifying China's ardent desire for peace. And another thing that most people will have missed is these are the combat veterans of the war. And if you look at them carefully, I want you to look at their uniforms and tell me what's missing. And if you said rank insignia, you would be right, because the Chinese People's Army was an army of equals. It did not have ranks. And for 97 years of its existence, for 49 of those years, up to the 1980s, the Chinese People's Liberation Army did not have ranks. And I think what this tells us is that what we have essentially is a people's war and a people's army that resulted in a people's victory. That is to say, you have an army of equals building a society of equals. And I think nothing speaks to that more powerfully than the fact that we had truly a people's army. The only way you could distinguish between high-ranking people and low-ranking people was actually the number of pockets. The officers had more pockets because they had to carry notebooks. But my point is that I think it's premature to say that Japanese imperialism or imperialism was defeated in this war. As William Faulkner said, the past is never dead. It is not even past. I just want to show you some images of the Nanjing massacre, and I also encourage people to see Dead to Rights, the movie. The image on the right is a young woman who has been raped. She is in a catatonic state. I caution people that these images are graphic. These are mass killings. These are people being used for bayonet practice. These are executions. Same thing here. You can see the mass, bodies. You can see the babies. These are women and children who have been raped. You can see the blood streaming from their genitals. Once again, I apologize for the graphic nature, but this is what really happened. And of course, we know it started with the Mukden in 1931. It was a false flag attack. And when the Japanese went and created this puppet state, it created a genocidal totalitarian, capitalist slave state, the likes that have never been seen in history. 10 million were conscripted into slavery. It was actually Japan's industrial powerhouse and granary, essentially what gave Japan the industrial power to take over all of Asia. And scholars have referred to it as a necro-capitalist state. I'll explain that further. And they've also referred to it as the Belgian Congo of the Far East. It started out with Chinese coolies from Shandong and Hebei. They did all the physical labor for the Japanese colonial system, but it was also a kind of drug-fueled gangster capitalism, where you had Japanese pimps and drug traffickers in the treaty ports in China who then became policy holders, policy leaders, and officials. And so there was massive drug and human trafficking, and it also has been completely whitewashed in the Western mind, because of the Cold War. What the Japanese imperialists has done has been completely whitewashed, so much so that, for example, Wendy Sherman at the State Department told the comfort woman essentially just to get over it. So let's talk a little bit more about this necro-political state. The coolies that originally that were in Manchuria were turned into slave laborers. The pimps became the slave state officials and also were involved in narco trafficking. Sex workers became comfort women, and then women were kidnapped and turned into comfort women. And it really was a genocidal necro-capitalist fascist state. A good recounting of this is done in the scholarship of Mark Driscoll, and he talks about some of the actual manifestations of this. We know that the Nissan company and Mitsui and Mitsubishi actually got started in Manchukuo. In fact, this is kind of the origins of the Japanese zaibatsu capitalist conglomeration. In Manchuria, or northern China really, the northeast of China, the Orichan people, they're a deer-herding ethnic minority of China. The Japanese simply genocided them. There were 1,000 left after the Japanese occupation. Same thing with the Herza people. We think at least 90% of the population were killed. After the Japanese left, there were 300 left. And of course, this was facilitated by the East Asia Development Board. This was the kind of ministry, responsible for industrial development in China. And essentially, it implemented a system of forced labor. By 1942, there were already 5 million enslaved in the mines and the war industries. And this was led, the director of the East Asia Development Board was General Yanagawa Heisuke, who was actually the commander responsible for the Nanjing massacre. And he institutionalized slave labor in Manchukuo. The world's deadliest mine disaster, the second worst industrial accident in history, happened in Manchukuo. There was a coal dust explosion in the mines, and in order to put out the fire and to save the mine, the Japanese simply sealed the mine pit and trapped 1,518 Chinese workers, and they all died. For the Japanese, the pit was more important than the miners. As I said before, the primitive accumulation of Manchukuo involved narco trafficking, sexual slavery, and slave labor. And at one point, by 1937, it was responsible for 90% of all white drugs. That is, opium and other narcotics came from Manchuria. Vespa is an Italian chronicler. He, talks about the number of drug and criminal activity, and also that the Japanese imperial army was involved in the drug traffic. Now, a very important character of Manchuria was Shiro Ishii, who was the founder of the Japanese Biological Warfare Unit. And we know that subjects who had the misfortune to be kidnapped and taken to the biological warfare unit were exposed to poison gas, cyanide, phosgene. They were infected with plague, anthrax, cholera, encephalitis, STDs. They were subjected to frostbite testing. They were subjected to live vivisection. And we know that at least 10,000 people were medically experimented, tortured, and killed. So these are some of the key figures associated with Manchukuo: Ishii, Kishi, and Masao Tagaki. I'll get to them. This is Shiro Ishii, to put a face to the name. He was rehabilitated by the United States because he turned over his research and he helped develop Fort Detrick. He was hired by the US military to train the US on biological warfare. And there's very, very good evidence that he was involved in the bio-warfare campaign during the Korean War. Nobusuke Kishi was the Vice Minister of Industrial Development in Manchukuo. He's the person who turned it into an industrial powerhouse. He's the person who signed the decree calling for the use of slave labor. And during that period, an average of 1.5 million Chinese were taken away to work as slaves every year. And he referred to them as dogs who would only understand brute force. An example of this necro-political capitalism was the Fushan coal mine in Manchuria. There were 40,000 men working as miners, of which 25,000 had to be replaced every year because they were dying in the mines. And of course, he was rehabilitated by the United States. He became prime minister. Here you see him living it up with Chiang Kai-shek and other high-ranking officials. And then decades later, his grandson, Shinzo Abe, also became prime minister. This is another important person. You may not know him as well. This is Masao Tagaki. He was an artillery and counterinsurgency officer in the Manchukuo Imperial Army. Most of us know him as Park Chung-hee. He was the US Quisling who became the dictator of South Korea. And he was responsible for tracking down a very important person in Manchuria, that a guerrilla leader who had the status of a Che Guevara of Northeast Asia. He was responsible for tracking him down. He never was able to track him down. And of course, if you look on the right, the second to the right is Kim Il-sung, who was also very important in the Northeast Anti-Japanese United Army. This was the Chinese-Korean military that fought the fascists. So these are some of the famous dynastic figures. Why do I say dynastic? Park Chung-hee's daughter became the president of South Korea. Kishi Nobusuke's grandson became the president, the prime minister of Japan. Of course, Kim Il-sung has their own dynastic succession. But when people talk about the Kim being a dynasty, you also have to look at the other dynasties. This is not exactly related to Manchuria, but this Lee Teng-hui, who was the president of Taiwan. And of course, he was a rabid Japanophile. And he stated that Taiwanese people are subjects of Japan, and Taiwan and Japan are one country. This is Louise Chow. She was born in Kobe, Japan. Her mother is American. It's suspected that her ties are much, much stronger to Japan and to the United States than to actually Taiwan province. So I won't go over the comfort women or the Yakuza or the industrialists, but I do want to point out that what we are seeing right now in the Pacific is a successor imperialism. What do I mean by that? Just as the French, who were the colonizers of Vietnam and Indochina, turned over their colonial project to the United States, we see the same thing. The United States, not only did it rehabilitate the Japanese fascists, but it took on all of their colonies. And so all the former Japanese colonies, that is to say Korea, Taiwan province, the Ryukyu Islands, that is to say Okinawa and the Philippines, these were all Japanese colonies, as well as Guam and Wake Island. And so the United States has become the successor imperialist. And it is currently, from the standpoint of global history, it's doing exactly the same thing that the Japanese are doing, which is to say that it is preparing for war against China. I believe that the march, the parade, is a strong message that sends a message to the United States and to Japan that China has defeated the fascists and that it is strong and it will never be subjugated again, and that it seeks peace, but it will not ever allow itself to be subjugated in the same manner that happened before. And that's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, KJ. I think that was, again, another really brilliant and so informative. I think the continuities between the World War and the imperialism that went before it and the imperialism that has come after it, I think these are very instructive. So thank you again. And of course, as always, you give these stunning presentations, always so informative and instructive. Thank you very much. We have a final speaker. Our final speaker is Keith Bennett. As most of you will know, he's the co-founder of the Friends of Socialist China website, long-standing scholar and activist, particularly focusing on issues relating to China and North Korea in particular. So Keith, please start.
Okay, thank you very much, Radhika, and everybody. I've been given.
You should turn on your video, Keith.
I thought it was.
Maybe you turned it off by mistake.
Okay.
Yeah, that's better.
Sorry. Apologies for that. I actually thought I'd turned it on. I must have turned it on and then turned it off again. Anyway, thank you, Radhika. Thank you, comrades. I've been given the slightly invidious task of speaking after quite a lengthy list of brilliant speakers. And so with that proviso, I will say something. So on May the 8th, 1945, people in Britain celebrated VE Day. 6 years of all-out war in Europe against Nazi and fascist tyranny had come to a victorious conclusion. But whilst the nation struggled with a collective hangover the next day, it did so with the knowledge that the war in East and Southeast Asia and in the Pacific continued, and nobody at that stage could be sure for how long. While, as events transpired, the war in Asia-Pacific was to last just a few more months, due not least to the decisive intervention of the Soviet Red Army, rather than to the criminal bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, this does serve to underline the fact, as we've heard already from other speakers, of course, that the World Anti-Fascist War began first in the East, specifically in China, and that it lasted the longest. The Chinese People's War of Resistance against Japanese aggression began, as we've heard, in 1931, after Japan rigged up the puppet state of Manchukuo in northeast China. This in turn became a nationwide war of resistance in 1937, with the Marco Polo or Lugu Bridge incident heralding Japan's all-out invasion. At that time, while progressive people around the world rallied to the support of China, the only state to take a clear-cut stand in support of the Chinese people's resistance was the USSR. And this fact clearly impacted on the entire geopolitical pattern in the region. The Soviet contribution to the defeat of Japanese militarism did not begin with the declaration of war on August the 8th, 1945, the date agreed between the USSR, the United States and Britain at Yalta. A key front was opened more than 10 years previously in the Mongolian People's Republic, with hundreds of clashes on the border with the so-called Manchukuo starting from January 1935. As tensions mounted, It clearly became a matter of when, not if, a major confrontation would take place between Soviet and Japanese forces in or adjacent to Mongolia. The stakes would be high. A decisive Soviet defeat would likely prompt a full-scale Japanese invasion of the Soviet Union, with the equal likelihood that this would prompt a further attack on the Soviet Union from the West, whereas a decisive Soviet victory would contain the Japanese threat for a considerable period and allow the Soviet Union relative freedom to devote its attentions to preparation to meet an attack from the West. That major confrontation was to take place from May to September 1939. Known as the Battle of Khalkhin Gol, after the river of the same name, this little-known conflict actually deserves to be known as a key battle that shaped the entire subsequent course of the Second World War. One Western military historian has described the significance of the Battle of Khalkhin Gol as follows. Although this engagement is little known in the West, it had profound implications on the conduct of World War II. It may be said to be the first decisive battle of World War II because it determined that the two principal Axis powers, Germany and Japan, would never geographically link up their areas of control through Russia. Had the USSR been forced to fight on two fronts simultaneously, the outcome of the war may have been very different, both in Asia and in Europe, and with cataclysmic consequences for humanity. Two factors were crucial in this. Besides the clear-cut Soviet victory at Khalkhin Gol, what must be acknowledged above all is the Chinese people's heroic resistance. Alongside the great patriotic war of the Soviet peoples, it was the Chinese people who shouldered the greatest burden and made the greatest national sacrifice in the world people's struggle against fascism. It was with the strong leadership of the Communist Party of China, which called for nationwide resistance by the whole Chinese nation and people first and most consistently, and with a national united front that would not have been created or sustained without the party's consistent, persevering, skillful, tenacious, and self-sacrificing efforts that, in the words of Hu Jintao, for a long time we Chinese contained and pinned down the main forces of Japanese militarism in the China theater and annihilated more than 1.5 million Japanese troops. The struggles of the Chinese, Soviet, and Mongolian peoples were also closely coordinated with that of the Korean people, who, their country having been colonized in 1910, had suffered under the iron heel of Japanese imperialism for longest. Although the Korean people had never ceased their fight for independence, for example with their declaration of independence in the March 1st, 1919 movement, as in China, the bourgeois nationalists proved themselves incapable of effectively leading the anti-fascist, anti-imperialist struggle. That task fell to the Korean communists led by Kim Il-sung, as KJ has just intimated, a brilliant guerrilla commander who for much of this time was based in northeast China. In the summer of 1942, the Soviet Union took the initiative to form the International Allied Forces, together with Chinese and Korean communists and other patriots. Kim Il-sung wrote in his memoirs With the Century, "With the organization of the IAF, a great change took place in our armed struggle. It can be said that with the formation of the Allied forces as a turning point, we switched from the stage of our joint struggle with the Chinese people to the stage of extensive joint struggle, which meant an alliance of the armed forces of Korea, China, and the Soviet Union, the stage of a new common front joining the mainstream of the worldwide anti-imperialist, anti-fascist struggle. Of course, within the overall context of the anti-fascist war, different forces had different class natures and hence different war aims and strategies, and naturally other people have dwelt on this too. So, just as bourgeois governments in Europe, from France to Norway to Greece, folded in the face of Nazi aggression, so supposed British colonial strongholds and fortresses like Hong Kong and Singapore fell to the advancing Japanese forces like skittles in a bowling alley. Throughout the region, it was the communists and the communist-led forces who led the resistance, fighting a protracted people's war, tying down the Japanese Imperial Army, surrounding them, and ultimately defeating them in China, Korea, Vietnam, Burma, Malaya, Indonesia, the Philippines, and elsewhere. These different class interests, essentially fighting for liberation or fighting for empire, clearly manifested themselves on the conclusion of the war. Hence, Ho Chi Minh's declaration of Vietnam's independence on September 2nd, 1945, was met with British forces attempting to control the country until the French colonialists could return. This in turn leading to 3 further decades of war that would sweep across and devastate Laos and Cambodia too. US forces landed in Korea, occupied the southern part of the peninsula, suppressing the People's Committees and imposing a white terror leading directly to a genocidal war 5 years later, as Jodie expounded in further detail. The Philippines communists returned to armed struggle, this time against US neo-colonial domination in 1946. The leader of the Communist Party of Malaya, Chin Peng, was awarded the OBE, the Order of the British Empire, for his wartime role fighting the Japanese, but by 1948 was leading a renewed armed struggle against British imperialism and subsequently against neo-colonialism, one that was only finally curtailed with a peace agreement signed between the Communist Party of Malaya and the Malaysian government in southern Thailand in December 1989. In China, with Chiang Kai-shek refusing to abide by the outcome of the Chongqing negotiations and reverting to visceral anti-communist form, the Revolutionary Civil War broke out in 1946, leading 3 years later to the founding of the People's Republic of China, which stands today as the single greatest event in history's long march towards human liberation. To a great extent, all this could be and indeed was foreseen, displaying the strategic and tactical brilliance that consistently characterized his approach to international affairs. In his 1940 article on policy, Mao Zedong wrote as follows: "The Communist Party opposes all imperialism, but we make a distinction between Japanese imperialism, which is now committing aggression against China, and the imperialist powers which are not doing so now, between German and Italian imperialism, which are allies of Japan and have recognized Manchukuo, and British and US imperialism, which are opposed to Japan, and between the Britain and the United States of yesterday, which followed a Munich policy in the Far East and undermined China's resistance to Japan, and the Britain and the United States of today, which have abandoned this policy and are now in favor of China's resistance. Our tactics are guided by one and the same principle: to make use of contradictions, win over the many, oppose the few, and crush our enemies one by one." Viewed in this light, we can understand, although the Western powers and the Western media either could not or would not, why on the rostrum of Beijing's Tiananmen Square, on the 80th anniversary of the September 3rd victory, President Xi Jinping was flanked by Russia's Vladimir Putin and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea's Kim Jong-un. That the leaders of the United States, Britain, and other imperialist powers chose to absent themselves not only shows who truly carried the main burden of the anti-fascist struggle, but also who remains committed to upholding the truth and a correct understanding of World War II and its outcome, and hence to standing against fascism and war today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Keith. An object lesson in how to inform and stimulate even after a whole string of others have informed and stimulated before you. Great speech showing the complex interconnection of the Chinese and Korean struggles, of the acuity of political understanding of a leader like Mao, and so many other things. Wonderful. So now we are open to questions, comments from the floor. We have about 25 minutes. We'll try to close on the hour. So 2 hours, try to close on the 2-hour mark. I can see one hand already, and while I'm waiting to get 1 or 2 more hands up, let me just remind you that this has been created, this event has been organized by Friends of Socialist China and by the International Manifesto Group. Please check out both organizations at their respective websites, socialistchina.org and internationalmanifesto.org. And please try and support us. Please try and spread the word about our events. Please join our mailing lists and about our events and other activities. So, and please support us in any way you can. Okay, we have some questions. So I will first go to Ulrich and then Diego. Ulrich, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you very much. I only want to make some comments, 3 short comments. You see behind of me a symbol called FIR, Federation of International Resistance Fighters. It is an umbrella organization of the resistance fighters, the members of the anti-Hitler coalition in the army and the deportation, the partisans, and that. We, as international anti-fascist organization, are mentioning the resistance fight in Asia and in the Pacific region since decades, but nevertheless, it is unknown on European level indeed. First of all, we made a report 20 years ago. It has been mentioned, but forgotten. This year, I have been invited for the Chinese embassy in Berlin, and there also we have a very interesting meeting and academical debate to the resistance fight in China, but it wasn't mentioned in any media. And this is what important, and that is why it's so brilliant part reference. This I heard this evening. In Germany and in Europe, they are ignoring this. But not only ignoring this, they ignore also the resistance fight and the liberators and the role of the liberation of the Soviet army in the anti-Hitler coalition fight. And this is what I think the historical revisionism, the ignorance about of the liberating and the anti-fascist fight is one of the topics what we have to fight against. And this wonderful conference gave a good aspect. One short detail in the end. We heard about the comfort women. Indeed, it is an unhuman behavior of the Japanese. But they are behaving in that way today too. We have a memorial place in Berlin, the comfort women of the Korean society in Berlin. And the ambassador of Japan tries to put away this memorial place. It is a private initiative of the Korean community. And the ambassador make intervention to the German foreign ministry to put away this memorial place, because they would not mention these crimes against women, against the people of Korea and also of China, Chinese people in that way. And this means the fight for a real historical remembrance is a fight also not only for history, it's a fight for today's perspectives, an anti-fascist and also in socialist perspective. Thank you very much for this conference. Full stop.
Thank you very much, Ulrich. I have now Diego and then Kimeng. Please go ahead, Diego.
Hi there. I will be very, very brief. First of all, to say thanks to all the presenters for the fantastic and informative presentation. I really, really enjoyed these. And one of the things the only thing that I wanted to mention, as I said, I will be very brief, is the aftermath of the war. And I would like to highlight the power and the impact of rhetoric and propaganda. Israel, with around 6 million Jewish victims, has intelligently played the victim game, exploiting Europe's guilt, which has brought them ample profits, becoming an overwhelmingly
powerful theocratic state that bullies the entire Middle East and pulls the strings of American politics. On the other hand, China, with nearly 18 million civilians brutally killed by Japan, stayed quiet, minded their own business, and got busy reconstructing their country and becoming the wonderful, peaceful, fair, and avant-garde country that today they are. This lies at the root of my love, admiration, and respect of China and the Chinese people. We really need to work together to avoid a war that will not benefit anyone and may put in risk our future. And again, this is a declaration, public declaration of love for China. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Kim Eng, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. What I wanted to ask the presenters is the fact that when I watched the military parade, I was very impressed by the fact that actually before that, during the SCO meeting, President Xi Jinping put out the Global Governance Initiative. And I think that has a lot to do with what KJ was talking about, in the sense that this war against imperialism is not over. Against fascism is not over. And in my mind, during, after the so-called peace talks in Yalta and whatnot, the imperialists, essentially because they were the victors, especially US and Western imperialists, hijacked the whole system and use it for their purposes. And that's the reason why the war against fascism is not over until now, which we see a third world war looming. So my questions to the presenters is how you see the linking up of President Xi Jinping's global governance initiative to the way that the world can be changed, the direction of where we're going, that can make peace more available to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim Eng. And since I don't see any other hands, I will take Alan's question as well, and then we will have a round of responses, and that should probably take us to our mark. Okay, Alan, please go ahead.
So I want to raise the straightforward question of Hiroshima. I don't think it's impossible. I don't think it's possible to discuss the current state of the world without talking about this. So I want to put this in context. My father was in Hamburg when the surrender of the Germans was announced, and he was he celebrated VE Day in the company of Jewish partisans, and was threatened with court-martial for fraternizing with the enemy. And we have letters that he has sent to my mother in which he explains that the army officers, because the Army Officer Corps was a completely separate class from the combatant corps, were fraternizing with the German officer army and discussing how they could construct a future Germany from which communism and Jews would be eliminated. So the war was actually a war that was fought both between the communist countries, and in that I include the emerging liberation struggle in China and the existing liberation struggle in the USSR and the imperialist countries, and between the imperialist countries. Now, what happened in Japan is this: in a certain extent, there's a certain parallel between what is happening now in Germany and what is happening in Japan. Germany is the most enthusiastically anti-communist, most enthusiastically pro-fascist, most enthusiastically let's go get the communists power in Europe. And Japan is not quite capable of lining up to play that role. But there's a similarity. They were constructed as post-war bulwarks of American presence in imperialism. They would not have been allowed to exist if it had not been for the fact that the Americans wanted them to exist as a bulwark against communism. And so the people of these two countries have subjected themselves to the most enormous cultural schizophrenia, which is that they've been fucked. I mean, you know, Hiroshima was the worst crime which any imperialist power has ever inflicted against anybody in the world. Why don't the Japanese say that we're not going along with it? Why don't the Germans say we're not going along with it? Because they've subordinated themselves to imperialism. Because they've swallowed the lies. So how do we get out of this? You cannot get out of it unless within Germany and within Japan, no, you can get out of it by smashing them, by crushing them, and that maybe is what they will have to suffer. But at least part of what you have to do is to link up with those people, those heroic and courageous people in Japan and in Germany that have said, we don't accept what imperialism did to us in the name of imperialism. So in that sense, what I'm trying to say is, how do you integrate Hiroshima, the worst crime that imperialism has ever committed? How do you integrate that into what you're saying?
A good question.
Very good question. Thank you, Alan. Okay, so that there is one more question, so I'll take it and then we will go to the responses. So Stephen, please go ahead. You're muted.
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Well, thank you very much. I want to take, first of all, the opportunity to express my intense gratitude for the Manifesto Group that constantly brings speakers and forums like this. It has been enormously important and enlightening. So I want to thank you.
And Friends of Socialist China.
And yes, and Friends of Socialists. So we have for a long time been asking, why is certain things not in the media? Why is this been left into the, in the sidelines and so forth? And I think that at this stage, I'm not surprised at all. So it's never a surprise that these things are left out. Recently, there's been, despite all the kind of, the propaganda that goes on, there is still a development that has emerged, in the last couple of, years and so forth, with this term called disinformation. We know there is information, there's false information, there's misinformation, but what exactly is disinformation? Disinformation, from the way I see it, is that it's not about inaccurate information, it's not about false information. Disinformation is just one thing, and that is a narrative that is not acceptable. When they arise, when they call out the kind of disinformation thing, it's a question of it doesn't fit the narrative that we want to produce right now. And under this kind of heading, everything is put out in that way. Not so long ago, there was a Senate hearing and there was NATO, a NATO officer was involved in it. And this person called for, what he called for was cognitive war. At this kind of time, he argued that there wasn't a single war that the Americans were involved in that they could not have won. They only were defeated because they were defeated by the forces inside the country that have risen for that. And to counter that, he talked about a cognitive war that will involve every single social institution within the country to produce the kind of narrative that they want. And so when we are talking about enlightening, when we talk about what do we do about this, you know, I think that we have to take into account this cognitive war that it is an upstaged pure propaganda on the other hand. And the question is, how do we fight this cognitive war? And this cognitive war has been fought everywhere on the globe in this way, because we have to get a different narrative and different perspective on what has been going on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Okay, so I guess, David, if you can keep it really very brief, I will take you and then we'll go to responses.
It's just a simple question. I know that in the coming to the closure of the Second World War, the communist movement led by the USSR, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, wanted to continue the wartime alliance. And I wonder simply, what was the attitude of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the USSR government, and the Communist Party of China to the atomic attack on Japan?
Okay.
At the time rather than.
Great, thank you. I think we will have responses maybe in the reverse order, giving Keith the first chance now to respond, and then ending with Chen Weihua and everyone in between. So Keith, if please respond to any and all comments that you wish to respond to,
Okay.
without feeling the pressure to be comprehensive. So.
Right. Okay. This is the one where it's better to go last. So.
Oh, sorry. Oh dear.
but never mind. I'll try and pick up on some of the points. I wanted to, Alan raised a lot of important points about Hiroshima and so on, and I don't think it's really possible to answer them all. But I'd like to make a few points about this. First of all, in terms of the victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and we obviously have to remember that those people are still suffering. Both some very old people, other people who were now very old but were very small children at the time, but also the children, the grandchildren, and the great-grandchildren who continue to suffer from deformities, from cancers and so on. So this is still a very live and a very touching issue. And I think, but one of the things that I think is all too rarely mentioned is it wasn't just Japanese people who were victims of the atomic bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There were numerous mainly Korean, but also Chinese slave laborers in those Japanese cities, as there were in all Japanese industrial cities, who also suffered terribly and needless to say, received less attention from the Japanese ruling class, but also from the Western powers in general. So, in terms of looking at why did the United States unleash the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, first of all, they knew that at the time that Japan had already indicated its wish to surrender before the atomic bombs were dropped. Why had the Japanese ruling class indicated that wish? That was, of course, because the Soviet Union had entered the war, which was or was about to enter the war, and as was agreed in Yalta, and the United States was terrified by the way that the Red Army had swept across the northeast of China and the Korean Peninsula, and both the Japanese ruling class and the United States, for slightly different but ultimately ultimately converging reasons, were terrified that the Soviet Red Army would enter Japan itself, just as it had done Germany. And we have to keep in mind that today the Japanese Communist Party has very little, if anything, to do with communism about it. But at the time, the Japanese Communist Party was a very different type of organization. Many of them had been living in Yan'an, in the Chinese liberated areas at the time, and were gaining experience of guerrilla warfare and so on. So I'd just like to say that on the question that or contribution that Kim Eng raised. Yeah, I think the timing was very significant. That the Shanghai Cooperation Organization met for its biggest gathering in its so far 25-year history in Tianjin, just scarcely more than a day before the September 3rd anniversary. And I think if you look at the scale of the international alignment of forces that China is driving, you have to look at that within the context of both the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summits, which took place from August on August the 31st and September 1st, and then the September 3rd, because cumulatively you can see how the majority, contrary to the Western propaganda, which will always say that you take the United States and Britain and maybe you throw in France or perhaps Japan, and they say that's the international community. The actual international community, the global majority, was represented in China at that time. And if you look at who was there, quite in a sense rightly, most of the media attention was directed at the presence of Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un, but nine of the former 15 republics of the Soviet Union were represented by their head of state or government. 7 out of the 10 members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations were represented at senior level, and so on. And I think that has to be put together with the fact that it's the Global Governance Initiative, which Kim Eng mentioned, of course, is just the latest in a whole series of international initiatives that Xi Jinping is advancing on behalf of the Chinese government and the Communist Party of China, which underline the fact that China is the power that is actually offering the realistic roadmaps for dealing with the existential issues facing humanity. And that's the context in which one has to see the military parade in Beijing, which, as KJ pointed out, was culminated with 80,000 pigeons and indeed 80,000 multicolored balloons. That this was, as Xi Jinping expressed it, that the theme of the parade, yes, was to show that China is now strong. It's not the oppressed and humiliated China of the past. It's a strong country that can and will defend itself. But as he said, that justice will prevail, peace will prevail, and the people will prevail. And that's the most important takeaway, I think, from the events in Beijing on September 3rd.
Great, thank you, Keith. KJ, please, you are next. Please respond to any and all of the comments you'd like to respond to.
Yes, thank you. Those are really, really important questions. The first question that I will respond to is around cognitive warfare. The key thing to understand is that the United States is a dying and waning empire, but it still has some tremendous strengths. One of the strengths that it has is, of course, its control over aspects of the financial system. The second key strength, or its superpower, is its exorbitant military power. And then the third, which is not so obvious, but is equally important and really undergirds the rest of its power, is its capacity for marketing, public relations, and advertising. No country excels at public relations and propaganda as much as the United States. And it's so good at it that the Western populations don't even realize that they're being propagandized. Charles Baudelaire said the devil's greatest trick was convincing the world that he didn't exist. The greatest feat of Western propaganda is convincing its population that they are not propagandized. And so because of that, there is such an extraordinary task ahead of us. But the first thing to understand here is that the US military considers warfare to be conducted in 6 domains: air, land, sea, and 3 domains of space: outer space, cyberspace, and mental space. In other words, your mind is literally seen as a terrain of battle. And what the United States seeks to do, especially as it escalates to war, is it seeks to control the information sphere. It seeks to dominate the information sphere, so much so that we can say that what it really does is it creates a no critical thinking zone. Just as it creates a no-fly zone before it starts attacking with infantry, it also creates a no-think zone before it goes to war. So if you understand that, and you understand that your mind is a terrain of contestation, then the job of every individual is to degauss their minds, to degauss their brains, and to resist occupation and colonization by this massive propaganda apparatus that is currently in the process of manufacturing consent for war and shutting down all critical and opposition voices for peace. That's the first thing to do. And you have to understand that this is something where you can actually be involved. You actually have the tools, because technically it is your mind. How can you tell when something is propaganda? Let me give you 3 very simple benchmarks. Anytime you see a report and it uses the term CCP, that is propaganda and disinformation, because the actual name for the party is the Communist Party of China, the CPC. And when the propagandists refuse to use the term that the Chinese refer to themselves with, it is actually an insult and an act of contempt. It is like using the N-word against the Chinese. And anybody who used the N-word, you would know immediately that they are not to be trusted. And likewise, anybody who uses the term CCP, you know that they're working in the domain of propaganda. Here's another signal. Anytime you get a message and it is contradictory, you know that you're working in the domain of propaganda. China is so weak, it's going to collapse the next minute. And at the same time, they say China is so big and powerful, it's going to overtake the world. Both of these things cannot be true at the same time. There is no such thing as Schrodinger's China. And because of that, you know that you're working in the domain of propaganda, because those contradictions are irresolvable. In other words, they're lies. And the third way you also know you're in the domain of propaganda is when you see any statement about China which is followed by "at what cost." This is what The Guardian and the New York Times do. They all say China is saving the planet, reducing greenhouse gases, but at what cost? Now you know that you're going to be deluged with propaganda. So those are some simple signals, but the key work is for us to be assiduous in critical thinking. Really, you have to think of this as a kind of a mental martial art, where you're constantly degaussing and resisting the propaganda. This is hard work, but it's essential, and it's the first place we start. And once having derived truth from facts, we share those facts, and we build out a constellation of networks of solidarity that share the truth with each other. One more thing, I just wanted to talk about the Global Governance Initiative. It's one of 3 global initiatives: the Security Initiative, the Development Initiative, the Civilizational Initiative, and it kind of caps those 3 with a kind of institutional infrastructure that is focused on bringing back rule of law into the international system. The US has run a rogue state with vigilante approaches and aggression to everything. This is an attempt to corral the world back towards the ideals of the UN Charter. And I think it's extraordinarily important. And it also ties into the SCO and the Tianjin Declaration, which is creating the foundations for this global governance by reasserting sovereignty of all countries. That is to say, the sovereignty of national sovereignty, but also digital sovereignty, energy sovereignty, and financial sovereignty. These are critical issues that are being built out. And then the last piece I'll say is about Hiroshima. I don't want to quibble about this because it's kind of unseemly to quibble about these kinds of things, but I do not believe that Hiroshima was the worst crime of the fascists. I mean, as I pointed out, Manchuria itself was much, much worse. Nanjing was much, much worse in terms of sheer human numbers. I don't know if we can actually compare these things, but it is an important question to ask is, why does Japan go along with the United States after having been so brutally bombed? And the answer to that is simply the comprador class and the structure of Japanese governance was created by the United States. In particular, the LDP, the ruling party, which has ruled as one party rule since 1955, was created by the CIA through CIA funding, through an alliance of war criminals, organized gangsters, the Yakuza, and unrepentant military industrialists. These all came together and they created the LDP, and they've essentially controlled Japanese politics since 1955. And so if we understand that, then we also have to understand that the challenge is to have people-to-people relations and to understand that the government is not a reliable partner. Last and quick comment is that the Hiroshima atomic bomb was 15 kilotons. Currently, as the US escalates to war against China, it is preparing nuclear war, and it is preparing tactical nukes for use against China. Those tactical nukes have a maximum yield of between 20 to 360 kilotons. In other words, what the US considers to be a usable tactical nuclear bomb against China is 24 times more powerful than Hiroshima. So I think we need to remember these things and understand the risks and what's really at stake. I've also shared some links in the chat if people are interested in a more discussion about this from myself.
Great, thank you, KJ. I guess we have Jenny next. Jenny, please go ahead.
Thank you. I don't know that there's an awful lot left to be said in answer to the questions after those two very full and strong responses. I'll just make a couple of side points about Japan, really. Well, one of them is a question. But one thing I want to say was that when I was in China, it was very much emphasized that we shouldn't talk about the anti-Japanese war. I mean, in the past, it's always been the anti-Japanese war, the anti-Japanese war. The point that was being made is that it wasn't anti-Japan, it was anti-Japan's aggression. It wasn't, it's not Japan as a whole, it's not the Japanese people, it was what they did, the aggression. So I thought that was worth mentioning. Really, I have a question, and I suppose that KJ could have answered it, or he did answer it, really, and I don't know whether Chen would also be able to say, which is, to what extent these really unreconstructed militarists are still lurking around within the Japanese military, behind the liberal facade of the government. For example, in this country, we're faced with a situation in which the far right could easily win an election. Could that be the case in Japan with an extreme right-wing victory in an election and taking over the country? I'll just say a few words about the Global Governance Initiative. Going back to what I was saying before, the result of World War II was a victory in that for China in that the United Front was recognized as an equal in the United Nations. And then after that, that was, you know, the imperialist powers have tried to reverse that and undermine that and ignore that. And the question at the moment is, you know, that the UN is so dysfunctional, partly because the world is dominated by the United States, and also partly because of the lack of unity amongst the global South and other countries in the United Nations. And I think, you know, if we take the longer span of China's foreign policy, once they were in a position to do so, and they were recognized, at least they were had diplomatic relations with most of the countries in the world, they have started to rebuild multilateralism bit by bit and step by step. And so in the last few years, we've seen, as people have mentioned, these three initiatives: the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, the Global Civilization Initiative. So these are all different initiatives that kind of drawing countries together for different reasons. Around some countries will support a development agenda, some countries will support a security agenda, some countries will support, you know, a mutual learning, people to people, civilizational exchange agenda. And so these are concrete ways in which people are working together. And the Global Governance Initiative is now the overarching initiative which can bring the whole of the world together around a multinational way of working, which the Chinese, you know, the goal is eventually to bring about a different system of international relations with the UN as its core. So the Global Governance Initiative is really a way of drawing together these different, you know, multilateral, you know, agendas into an overall framework from which to rebuild the values of the United Nations.
Great, thanks, Jenny. We have then Ken, and then Jodie, and then Chen Weihua.
Yeah, I know we're well over time, so I'll just say one thing, which is, again, referring to the governance initiative. I think that it's a very good thing, and it has a strong resonance with what we're talking about in terms of China's role in defeating fascism, you know, back 80 years ago, which is that the governance initiative it's China offering its experience. You know, as if other countries want to learn from that, emulate that, that's great. They're happy to be of assistance with that. But it's not a matter of imposing something. And the same thing, I think, was true in the struggle against fascism, and in the revolution in general, that the party led a movement which led by example. It led by being honest and having integrity and being upright and serving the people, rather than, you know, here's our program, here's what we're going to do, and you're going to go along with it no matter what. And the governance initiative, all the initiatives offer the same kind of model today, which is to say, see what we've done, see what our experience is. If you find that to be worthy of emulation, great, but it's not something that we're going to impose. Of course, in stark contrast with Western imperialism, which basically is, you know, do it our way or we're not going to help you. And that's, I think that's a very important long-term connection and long-term quality of the movement in China that we need to recognize. And thank you, everybody, for this amazing experience today.
Indeed, amazing. Yes, Jodie, please.
Thank you. And everyone has said so much already that I don't want to continue, except to say that, you know, what was reflected and what was said is that it's the people power. You know, I thought Ken was like really looking to what the people do when they're inspired by truth and by humanity. So I just say, you know, we look at this right now, for it's up to us to teach and to create a new ground to stand on. Could we just say show up? So in this time of imperialism, when it's in full force, as we witness yet another genocide at the hands of imperialism, We take a page from those we've been talking about, the people of the East who stood against imperialism and fascism. It is the people. So we, each of us, have the responsibility to give others confidence. When people see us stand up in Congress, they say, you give me confidence and courage. So to be visible, to stand on a ground of truth, as you were just saying, Ken, about like that China does, stands on the ground of truth. Could we say educate, inspire, and activate? So in this Chinese year of the snake, as the skin is being pulled away and more people can see what has been hidden from them, most of it being revealed through the lens of the hellish violence of what is being unleashed on the Palestinians in Gaza by white imperialism, again, devaluing people of color. We have the task of educating and bringing it to bigger audiences, as No Cold War has been committed to doing since your founding. So China's not our enemy. We give you ways to learn and engage each week, and I'll post our most recent one here. And I look forward to engaging with all of you as we continue to spread truth against all these lies. Thank you for including me today and for all the wisdom that I'm taking away.
Thank you so much, Jodie. That was great. And Chen Weihua.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just will try to be very brief on 2 points, I believe. And I really appreciate the fact that many of you mentioned it's the Chinese people, actually the Chinese nation, which played a major role of resisting the Japanese aggression, because it's very important that the Chinese people, we need to emphasize the ultimate sacrifice by the Chinese people, and it's the ultimate fight of the Chinese people against aggressors. And, it was a national crisis, and it was actually, fight, people, I mean, in today's terms, people in both sides of the Taiwan Straits. I mean, it's just a proof, a reminder that the Chinese mainland and Taiwan are one nation and one country. I mean, if you look it up. The second part, I think a lot of good, mention of this Western disinformation campaign, and also China's global governance initiative. I think and a lot of us talk already mentioned. I mean, obviously, China aspires a new multilateral world with global cooperation, with the international rule of law, and with, not just China, India, and many developing countries in the global south is playing an important role, because as you mentioned, the U.S. hegemonic power, and many of, I would describe, the puppet states trying to hijack the international system for decades. They try to portray themselves as the good guy. I mean, force for good. But, as Jodie just mentioned, those people, countries who endorsed the Gaza genocide in the first place are most of the country who call themselves the leading democracies and a force for the good, unfortunately. And they were actually the bad guy. I mean, as the UN determined that it was a genocide, and and who were the good guy who waged the war, bombed Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, so it's all those self-claimed leading democracies. And so I think as this review exposed their so-called disinformation, how they are skillful in the disinformation campaign, try to hijack the narratives. Lastly, I just want to thank the Manifesto Group and the Friends of Socialist China, and all of you. Code Pink, I admire your work, always. And so thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chen Weihua. Thanks again to all the speakers who were absolutely brilliant. As you see in the chat, the compliments are simply flowing in. I just want to say in closing 2 things. Number one, I meant to clarify but didn't do it at the right time, but we had 2 people here today, Jenny Clegg and Keith Bennett, both of whom were present at the military parade. And I think we were very honored to have them, and they were honored to be there. And secondly, as of course, to remind you that the International Manifesto Group and Friends of Socialist China are the two co-organizers of this brilliant webinar. If you like our work, please visit our website, sign up for our newsletters, and please, please, please spread the word about the work we are doing. Share this video, which will be on YouTube, and share it widely with other people who you think will care about this. So thank you very much for all that. Thanks again to the speakers, and goodbye.